Take $500,000, put it into one ETF, walk away for 5 years. The ETF you picked decides whether you come back to a bigger account, a steady paycheck, or a number that looks great and changes nothing. 3 different lives, one starting amount. In this video, John takes $500,000 and runs it through 5 different ETFs over the same 5-year period, and you'll see exactly what the account looks like at the end of each year and exactly what each ETF pays him along the way. One of these ETFs pays him over $5,000 a month by year 5. Another almost triples his money in the same window. They're not the same ETF. And in the end, I'll show you how to combine all 5 ETFs into one portfolio that gets you the best of both worlds. The place John starts is in the same place almost everyone does, the S&P 500, or by its ticker, VOO. It's the name everyone gave him when he asked where to put $500,000, so this is where he starts. VOO is the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. It tracks the 500 biggest companies in the U.S., names like Apple, Microsoft, Amazon. The bigger the company, the more weight it gets inside the fund. There's no clever strategy, no stock picking. The fund just owns the U.S. market and holds it. The expense ratio is almost nothing, about 3 cents on every $100 invested. On John's $500,000, that works out to roughly $150 a year in fees. That means almost all of his money stays at work instead of going to Vanguard. This is the ETF you buy when you want one decision made once that you don't have to think about again and again. You're not betting on a sector, you're not chasing a trend, you're just owning the U.S. economy and trusting that over time it goes up. 3 numbers explain how VOO actually pays back. The dividend yield sits at 1.09%. Dividend growth has averaged about 6.07%, and share price appreciation has run at roughly 13.03%. And that last number is where almost all of the work gets done. One thing to lock in before we run the numbers, the projections assume that every dividend VOO pays out goes straight back into buying more shares. That's why the account compounds faster than share price alone would suggest. So here's what that does to John's $500,000 over the next 5 years. By the end of year 1, projections put the account at $570,600. Year 2 takes it to $650,736. Year 3 pushes it to $741,667. Year 4 climbs to $844,817, and by year 5, the balance would be sitting at $961,797, almost double in 5 years without picking a single stock, without timing a single trade, without doing anything but holding it. John sees that number land and understands why everyone told him to buy this one, but then he checks the income column. In year 1, dividends come out to $5,450. By year 5, they reach $6,900, about $575 a month. $575 on an account worth nearly $1 million. That's not broken. That's exactly how VOO is built. The fund is designed to grow, not to pay. Almost every dollar VOO earns gets reinvested into share price, which is why the balance climbs the way it does. The dividend was never the point. Paying you is not a huge part of VOO's design. But John didn't come here just to watch the account get bigger. He wanted to know what $500,000 actually does for him. And $575 a month on nearly $1 million isn't a number that changes anything in his life. So if VOO grows the account but barely pays him, where does the income piece actually come from? And the answer to that isn't another U.S. fund. Turns out, you have to leave the U.S. to find it. Most of the world's biggest companies aren't in the U.S., they're in Europe, in Japan, in emerging markets, places John's never bought a single share of because nobody told him to. That's where VXUS comes in. VXUS is the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF. It owns over 8,500 companies, basically every public company outside the United States, all wrapped into one fund. No country bets, no sector picks, just the rest of the world in one ticker. Fees here run about 5 cents per $100 invested. On John's $500,000, that's around $250 a year. A bit higher than VOO, but still small enough that fees aren't the conversation. The reason people add VXUS isn't speed, it's that international companies tend to pay more of their profits out as dividends instead of reinvesting them. So the income side starts behaving differently the moment the money lands. VXUS runs a 2.77% dividend yield, almost 3 times what VOO pays, with dividend growth around 6.14% and share price appreciation closer to 5.86%. Less acceleration on the account, more cash showing up along the way. Here's what 5 years of VXUS does to $500,000. Year 1 lands at $543,150. By year 2, the account reaches $590,066. Year 3 brings it to $641,080. Year 4 moves it up to $696,555. And by year 5, the balance ends at $756,885. That ending number is over $200,000 lower than where VOO finished. And that's usually where people stop the comparison. But listen, VXUS isn't done. Look at this. John checks the income column, and this time it's a completely different story. Year 1 pays $13,850. By year 5, the dividend climbs to $19,512, about $1,626 a month. $1,626 every month on the same $500,000 that paid him only $575 a month inside VOO. That's almost 3 times the income from a smaller account. Not because VXUS is doing something clever here, but because international companies just hand more of their earnings back to shareholders year after year by design. John starts to see the trade clearly now. VOO grew the account faster, but barely paid him. VXUS pays him real money, but it grows the account slower. Neither one is wrong, they're just answering different questions. So now there's a third question worth asking. What if the income didn't have to come from giving up growth? What if there was a fund built to do both? And that's the question SCHD was built to answer. SCHD is the Schwab U.S. Dividend Equity ETF. But it's not just a basket of dividend-paying stocks, it's screened. To get into SCHD, a company has to have been paying dividends for at least 10 years, has to have the cash flow to keep paying them, and has to actually be growing those dividends over time. Skip any of those tests, and the company doesn't make the cut. That's why SCHD only holds about 100 companies instead of the 500 or 8,500 we just looked at. It's not trying to own the market. It's trying to own the part of the market that pays you well and grow what it pays. The fee on SCHD runs about 6 cents per $100. On John's $500,000, that's about $300 a year in fees. Cheap enough that the screening doesn't cost him anything that matters. And the screen shows up clearly when you look at the metrics. SCHD pays a 3.4% dividend yield, meaningfully higher than VOO and slightly higher than VXUS. Dividend growth runs at about 10.43%, almost double what either of the first 2 funds delivered. And share price appreciation comes in around 8.87%, slower than VOO, but better than VXUS. SCHD is what income and growth looks like in numbers. So here's what it does to John's $500,000 across the same 5 years. Year 1 brings the account to $561,350. Year 2 carries it up to $630,525. Year 3 pushes it through to $708,565. Year 4 hits $796,651, and by year 5, SCHD lands at $896,130. That's almost catching VOO on growth. The gap between them at year 5 is around $65,000 on a fund that is also paying real income. And the income is where SCHD pulls clear of both VOO and VXUS. First year, $17,000. Fifth year, $28,816, about $2,401 a month. $2,400 every month on an account that's also growing at almost the speed of the S&P 500. This is the first fund that doesn't make John give something up. The growth is there, the income is there, and the dividend itself keeps growing year after year by design. For a second, this looks like John's answer, the fund that does both well enough with no obvious cost. But there's a ceiling. SCHD pays well, but it doesn't pay a lot. And John hasn't seen what happens yet when an ETF stops trying to balance two things and just goes all in on one of them. So, 3 ETFs down, 2 left. Next, I'll show you what happens when an ETF only focuses on income, then an ETF that only focuses on maximum return. And in the end, I'll show you how John combines all 5 into one portfolio, which gets him the best of both. But first, let's look at the ETF that's built to pay, and that is JEPI. JEPI is short for JP Morgan Equity Premium Income ETF, and it's built on a completely different idea than anything we've looked at so far. JEPI doesn't just hold stocks and wait for dividends. It holds large U.S. companies, names like Microsoft, Visa, MasterCard, and on top of that, it sells options on those holdings every month. Each option JEPI sells brings in cash from another investor who's paying for the right to buy those shares at a set price. That cash gets pooled with regular dividends and paid out to JEPI shareholders. So John isn't just collecting dividends, he's collecting dividends plus monthly option income. That extra layer is why JEPI's fee is higher, about 35 cents on every $100 invested. On John's $500,000, that's around $1,750 a year. Not cheap. But this isn't a fund trying to be cheap, it's a fund trying to pay. And trying to pay shows up in JEPI's metrics in a way nothing else does. The dividend yield sits at 8.33%, more than double SCHD, more than 7 times VOO. Dividend growth is slower at 2.79%, and share price appreciation is the lowest we've seen at 1.45%. Income clearly gets the priority here. Everything else takes a back seat. And here's how that plays out on John's $500,000 across 5 years. Year 1 lifts the account to $548,900. Year 2 moves up to $603,195. Year 3 clears $663,543. Year 4 reaches $730,690. And by year 5, the balance lands at $805,480. The account grew, but not the way VOO grew it. Not even the way SCHD grew it. The income, on the other hand, well, that's the headline. Year 1 pays John $41,650. By year 5, that number reaches $64,195 a year, about $5,350 a month. $5,350 every month, more than a lot of full-time jobs pay. So JEPI isn't competing with the others on growth. It's not trying to. The whole fund is built around one job, turning $500,000 into essentially a paycheck. And by year 5, that paycheck becomes the size of a very generous paycheck. But there's a cost, and the projections make it visible. JEPI's account ended at $805,480. VOO's ended at $961,797. That's roughly $156,000 of growth John gave up to get the income he's holding now. So now the question flips. If picking JEPI means giving up that much growth, what happens if John does the opposite? That is VGT. VGT is the Vanguard Information Technology Index Fund. It owns U.S. tech almost exclusively. Over 99% of the fund is in technology. We're talking companies like Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Broadcom, Oracle. There's software, hardware, semiconductors, the whole stack. There's zero diversification across sectors here. There's no income strategy. The fund is built to ride one thing, the long arc of U.S. technology, and let everything else take care of itself. VGT's fee is about 9 cents per $100 invested. On John's $500,000, that's around $450 a year, slightly higher than VOO, but the fee was never the cost. The cost here is concentration. When tech wins, this fund wins big, but when tech struggles, John feels every bit of it. You can see the bet spelled out in the metrics. VGT's dividend yield is 0.37%, almost nothing. Dividend growth runs at about 5.49%, but from a base so small it barely registers. Where VGT separates itself from everything else is share price appreciation, which has averaged around 22.39%. That single number is doing the work that VOO's 13%, SCHD's 8.87%, and JEPI's 1.45% can't touch, not even close. So here's what happens when John puts $500,000 into VGT for 5 years. Year 1 jumps the account to $613,800. Year 2 surges to $753,117. Year 3 runs up to $923,664. Year 4 crosses into seven-figure territory at $1,132,434. By year 5, the balance would be sitting at $1,387,984, almost triple from $500,000 to nearly $1.4 million in 5 years. The growth story here is so big it requires no explanation. The number makes every other fund in this video look slow. As for the income, well, it's a footnote. In year 1, the dividend is $1,850. By year 5, it's $1,998, or about $167 a month, on an account worth nearly $1.4 million. So the account almost tripled, but the income barely moved. By year 5, John's $1.4 million pays him less per month than VOO did on $500,000. So you might be thinking, well, something is broken here. But it's not in the fund. The fund is doing exactly what it was built to do. Tech companies don't pay dividends. They reinvest into research, into hiring, into the next product cycle. So as the share price climbs, the dividend stays flat and the yield collapses against itself. The bigger VGT gets, the less it pays, by design. Okay, now John has the full picture. VOO grew the account, but barely paid him. VXUS paid more, but grew slower. SCHD did both in moderation. JEPI paid him a paycheck, but barely moved. While VGT almost tripled the account, but paid him nothing. 5 ETFs, 5 different versions of what $500,000 can do over 5 years. And unfortunately, not a single one of them on its own gives John everything he wanted. Which leads us to the question he probably should have started with. What if John didn't have to pick just one? So John doesn't pick just one. He takes the $500,000 and splits it across all 5 ETFs with one rule guiding him. Every fund gets the weight that matches what it's actually good at. So $150,000, about 30% of the portfolio, goes into JEPI. JEPI is the income engine, so it gets one of the biggest slices. This is the fund that makes the monthly paycheck real. Another $150,000, the same 30%, goes into SCHD. JEPI pays the income now, SCHD grows it, both at scale, working together. $100,000, 20%, goes into VXUS. International dividends pay differently than U.S. dividends, and VXUS keeps the income stream from depending entirely on what U.S. companies decide to do. $50,000, 10%, goes into VOO. The S&P 500 is the steady backbone. It just compounds in the background while the dividend funds do the heavy lifting on income. And the final $50,000, the last 10%, goes into VGT. This is the growth engine, small enough not to swing the whole portfolio, but large enough to put real tech upside under everything else. No fund is doing the entire job. Each one is doing the part it's actually built for. When you blend the metrics together at those weights, the combined portfolio comes out at a 4.22% dividend yield. Dividend growth around 6.35% and share price appreciation of roughly 7.81%. Numbers that don't look extreme in any one direction. Now run that mix on John's $500,000 across the same 5 years. Year 1 puts the account at $560,145. Year 2 builds it to $627,180. Year 3 lifts it to $701,856. Year 4 carries it to $785,004. And by year 5, the balance would be sitting at $877,540. And the income runs alongside it the whole way. Year 1 pays $21,095. Year 5 reaches $31,227, about $2,602 a month. $2,600 a month, while the account grows to $877,540. Compare that to where each ETF ended on its own. VGT ended higher on the account, $1.4 million. JEPI ended higher on the income at $5,350 a month. The combined portfolio doesn't beat either of them on its own metric, but it doesn't lose to them either. John's account still grew by 75% over 5 years. His monthly income still beats what most people earn from a part-time job, and no single ETF, no single sector, no single strategy is carrying the whole plan on its back. When tech runs hot, VGT pulls. When U.S. dividend stocks rally, SCHD pulls. When option income stays strong, JEPI does the heavy lifting. When international markets recover, VXUS pulls. And underneath all of it, VOO does what VOO has always done. The portfolio isn't trying to win at any one race. It's trying to never lose all of them at the same time. $1 million sounds like a great return, but most people don't have $500,000 sitting around to start with. So, I built a 3 ETF portfolio that does exactly that. $10 a day, projected to reach $1 million. That video is on screen right now.